you guys.
Good work, John. John, mate.
Most of you guys know Joe Harper. Joe Harper's one of the first guys with this union. Paying dues for more than 20 years. Showing up in meetings. Doing what he was asked. Being a brother. All his life, he ran from one place to another to support his family. The only damn the company gave about him was to have him run more and more until he run himself off the road. Now the company don't give a damn at all. But I want to tell you guys something. We ain't asking the company for nothing. Because we're going to take care of Joe. We're taking care of his doctor bills. We're taking care of his family. Because Joe's a good union man. And we're taking care of him and the people he loves. And I'll tell you something else. You join this union, well, get your money for overtime and doctor bills. You won't have to kill yourself making a buck, like you're doing now, like my old man did. You join this union to make us strong. It'll make you strong. And I swear to you, as I'm standing here, that no company bastard living up in the heights is going to come down here and walk all over your lives. Promise you that. Come on, Joe, let's go.
Where do I sign?
If the Teamsters hadn't started and get 40 hours a week and vacations and all these nice things that we have, the public wouldn't have it.
I give my little speech to these young future leaders about unionism, because a lot of our school books are not addressing that issue today.
That's our problem of getting into the colleges, getting into the high schools, getting into the textbooks. The fact that there is a great contribution made by organized labor to the society we have today, to the great laws we have today, the laws against child labor, the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, overtime, job protection, all the things we take for granted today came from movements of laboring people, organized labor, demanding these things in the workplace.
In the 19th century, horse-drawn wagons were the motor trucks of today. The team drivers, or Teamsters as they were known, were the hard-working men that drove these wagons, making trade possible and enabling our nation to grow.
Well, you know, A to B goes the train, saying goes the plane. But everything that reaches there, or comes from there, has to be moved by a truck. In the old days, when the trains were still there, it was always by a wagon. I got great uncles who did that.
Everybody here has driven an automobile in a blizzard. Think about driving a horse and wagon with no cover in a blizzard.
Being a teamster and driving a team, it wasn't like getting in the truck and the truck was loaded and go out and make your deliveries. There was a lot of prep for that before you left. My father was a very good family man. His stable was just down the street from here. He'd take us down on a Saturday and Sunday because he took care of the horses, and we'd have to take them out of the stalls, clean the stalls.
When I was a kid, I drove a wagon. I went from Chicago around, this neighborhood to Evanston, 15, 16 hours with a horse and wagon making deliveries. Rain, sleet, or shine, always on the job.
But team drivers were exploited, and their working conditions were harsh.
I remember my dad, 3 o'clock in the morning, he was already up because the day started very early. You had to go in, get your horse. Like today, we have DOT regulations where we have to pre-trip a truck. A little harder pre-tripping a horse. Check the legs for heat around the ankles and the knees. Make sure the horse was feeling okay. Feed the horse, brush the horse down, water him, put all the tack and equipment on the horse, take him out, hook him up to the wagon that you were assigned for that day, This was all before you start getting paid.
Milkman go down the street, he'd take his little case, deliver maybe 2-3 doors, and you'd see the horse walk and stop by the third house. And he'd get back into the wagon, put the milk back in there.
My uncle, Severio, I know there were times, the man worked with a broken arm because there was no security on the job. Didn't say anything. He had a family to take care of. He couldn't go in and tell the boss, hey, I broke my arm, I can't work. His job wouldn't be there when he got back.
My father's 96. I make sure he sits down with my boys on a regular basis and recollects everything that went on where he's from. He was originally born in Pittsburgh, and his father was a teamster. I mean, real horses and wagon, his brother. And we need to talk about those things. Talk about working for $7 a week. Talking about putting 2 tons of coal in a chute for 50 cents a day.
In 1900, a typical team driver worked 12 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and his pay averaged $2 a day.
They'd start at 4 in the morning. By the time they get to their office in town, it's probably 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And there was a little place on Broad Street in Boston, a little barroom that used to open up, and all the teams would be lined up from different companies. But his boss used to come down. He could look down the street, but he couldn't tell whose teams were whose, but he'd whistle. And them ones that belonged to his stable would drag that thing all the ways down. And now these, my father said, oh, they'd come out of the barroom after they had a couple of double headers, just to warm them up. And they'd look, the horses going, they'd have to get out to the office, and the boss would be waiting for them.
By the end of the 19th century, commercial growth was transforming North American cities. Railroad traffic was on the rise. Early Teamsters transported goods to and from the trains. Teamsters also provided transportation for people traveling around the expanding cities. In an increasingly urban world, Americans needed more Teamsters.
The emblem of the Teamsters Union is such a great emblem because it has the 2 horses and the wheel. And that symbolizes this early beginning, which is our heritage of this great union of transportation.
In the 1890s, groups of team drivers began organizing into local unions to try to improve their wages and working conditions and better their position in society. From the very beginning, the union was inclusive and diverse. Many new Teamsters were African American, and nearly half were European and Canadian immigrants.
In them days, very, very hard to belong to a union without getting abused verbally, job assignments. With the Teamsters, it's an inclusive union, not an exclusive union.
In 1903, in Niagara Falls, New York, under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, then president of the AFL, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters was formed. A lack of laws protecting working people hindered many early organizing drives.
Did you know the history of Montgomery Ward and what they did to the men that were unloading freight cars? They used to get hired for the day. They would sit in a room. How many, I don't know. They would go in and empty a freight car, come off the clock, go sit there. He could work 18 hours in one day to get 8 hours. And that's what Montgomery Ward was doing to them. So he decided to do something about it, and he did. He organized Montgomery Ward.
The employer reacted with viciousness that would rapidly become violent as 4,600 new Teamsters were forced out on strike. The strike lasted more than 100 days and tragically took 21 lives. In the end, Montgomery Ward's cutthroat tactics and the brutality of the hired thugs and strikebreakers broke the strike. In the face of this early major setback, the union knew it had to make a change. Daniel J. Tobin, a first-generation Irish-American, was an up-and-coming president of Boston's Joint Council 10 and had seen the importance of aggressive organizing firsthand. Tobin had new ideas and national support, and at the 1907 IBT convention, the 32-year-old Tobin was elected general president.
We had this marvelous gentleman named Daniel Tobin, who became the president of the International Teamsters in 1907. And he continued to run that into the 50s. And he took a membership from 40,000 and he built it to over 1 million.
By this time, the advent of the motor car was beginning to change the freight-moving industry and our nation as a whole. New motor trucks would eventually replace horses, and Tobin saw the writing on the wall. Tobin set to work shoring up the union's weak finances and initiating aggressive organizing campaigns in the rapidly growing motorized truck delivery industry, as well as targeting membership outside the traditional team drivers.
Dan Tobin was a very well-known organizer. He went around locally, he did things to help people out. And he had a movement going that they followed him because they saw what a successful man, how he ever did anything.
He was a real gentleman. He'd come up there, and I can remember that years ago, Dan and all the big wide brim hats. I mean, these people took pride. They dressed the part. They went out there, and he was very congenial. He wouldn't come to visit his family without stopping to pass the time of day with all the little kiddos riding their bikes out in front of his house.
While the Teamsters always welcomed women, by 1917 they made huge gains for women in the laundry industry. The union won a non-negotiable clause in their contract that African American and white women would be paid the same wages.
The Teamsters Union have always been a leader in the labor movement. I mean, we were the first people to talk about equality of work, equal work for equal pay for women, for blacks, for everybody. The good thing about a union agreement is it's colorblind, and it's blind to gender. It just says this is the rate of pay for this work. And if you have women working that job, they get the same pay. That was a great hurdle.
The industrial boom that began as the United States prepared to enter the First World War created thousands of jobs in freight and associated industries. The Teamsters' aggressive organizing brought many of these new working men and women into the union, securing a better future for thousands of Americans. The Clayton Antitrust Act declared that unions were not unlawful, and workers' compensation bills were passed in most states. In what would become a tradition of sacrifice and service, Teamsters rallied to serve the nation during the war, helping to secure military success by swiftly moving troops and supplies from ports to front lines. The eventual victory of the Allies and a prosperous peacetime economy allowed the Teamsters to further grow and expand their influence. While other organizations throughout American society were focused on forcing women back into the home, the Teamsters continued to organize women in the workplace and even train them to be union representatives.
Teamsters are working women just like the men are. And, you know, long ago, they were there in the factories just like the men were. They just weren't recognized because they were supposed to be at home taking care of their kids.
The Teamsters also expanded their jurisdiction, affiliating with the Canadian Trades and Labor Congress. The Roaring Twenties were fueled by rapid expansion, financed in large part by a completely unregulated stock market. On Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the markets collapsed, setting off a tidal wave of panic as investments were laid worthless. Confidence in our nation's banks was shaken, businesses failed by the thousands, and the nation's economy ground to a halt. Working men and women bore the brunt of the economic turmoil that would forever be known as the Great Depression.
We had long lines of people waiting to get soup and bread. The employers could abuse workers because they had hundreds waiting for a job. They really, it was their call. They could do anything they want, and they truly exploited workers in the 1930s.
With so many members out of work, the union was facing the biggest challenge in its short history, and Dan Tobin needed to act quickly. He would find his greatest ally in the newly elected president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR won passage of several legislative initiatives in his New Deal program. His National Recovery Administration established minimum wages and maximum hours for workers in each industry, standards designed to encourage industrial recovery and help combat widespread unemployment. Most importantly for working people, the NRA gave workers the right to organize. Tobin worked tirelessly to help FDR build a consensus of cooperation that would stabilize our economy and pull the nation from the grips of economic depression.
I present to you President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There are some
would not only stop now the progress we are making in social and labor legislation, but would even repeal what has been enacted during the past 7 years.
But the recovery was slow, and FDR encountered significant dissent among the employers of the day. Companies routinely ignored the law giving workers the right to organize, and violently fought organizing efforts across the country.
My dad had been on a picket line backing up his brother Teamsters that were on strike at a company that had hired strikebreakers and scabs, and they showed up one day, and of course there was a fight on the picket line, and he was hit over the head probably with a axe handle or a baseball bat, and it split his head open. He sat on a chair, but being 5 or 6 years old, I stood on the chair behind him and sewed up his head. Man never flinched.
During 1933 and 1934, workers in nearly every industry, from the textile workers in the South to the auto workers in Toledo to West Coast longshoremen, were forced out on strike.
It was basically the drivers for Local 574, and it was an area where all the produce was delivered by Teamster trucks across the metropolitan Twin City area. And it started out as a fight for a decent wage and to control the 7-day work week and get it to a 5.5-day work week. It was orchestrated by some very strong leaders who were experts in planning. And that would be the Dunn brothers, Farrell Dobbs, and so it lasted a number of months. The Employers Association enlisted the help of the National Guard, the Minneapolis Police, and they also brought in hundreds and hundreds of strikebreakers, essentially goons. That was part of it. There's no question about that. And so at one point we had as many as 10,000 workers on the street fighting this battle. And it was a very intense battle where a lot of our members were killed, a lot of them with severe beatings. And eventually, President Roosevelt got involved in it. They were able to convince that Employers Association that to continue on with this struggle against the Teamsters Union was the wrong thing to do. And they interjected their power and helped settle the strike. It was a great victory for the Teamsters Union. It was a victory that really set the stage for the growth of the Teamsters Union. It really exploded after the 1934 Teamsters strike.
The strike's overwhelming success was a major step in turning the Teamsters into a militant industrial union, with a reputation for winning the important fights. This overwhelming economic unrest convinced President Roosevelt and others in government that a bridge between labor and government was desperately needed to avoid further potentially revolutionary unrest.
Well, the relationship between Tobin and the President Roosevelt was very, very close. The President appointed Tobin as his advisor on labor matters, which was a tremendous recognition for Tobin.
He spoke to the nation on labor issues on nationwide stations for the Roosevelt. He also went to Europe and visited with Churchill.
The landmark passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 provided a statutory legal framework for how companies were to deal with unions, recognized unions as the legal representatives of employees, and most importantly, protected workers' lawful right to organize, free of employer intimidation or coercion.
The National Labor Relations Act is now the law of the land.
Tobin continued to focus the union on organizing, and the Teamsters continued to grow through the 1930s. But while Americans recovered, Europe was embroiled in war. President Roosevelt dispatched Dan Tobin to assess the readiness of our European allies. Tobin's report to the president confirmed what FDR had already feared. America would soon be at war. Dan Tobin knew that once again the Teamsters would be called on to serve our nation. As in any war, it is the working men and women of the nation that bear the burden, and World War II was no exception. With the help of Dan Tobin, President Roosevelt sought the support of union leaders all over the country. The Teamsters pledged their support, promising no work stoppages that might threaten the war effort. The union also led the drive to buy war bonds and even offered to give the government an $8 million interest-free loan to help win the war. But the sacrifice of Teamsters would include much more. Over 125,000 Teamsters were enlisted in America's military operations, and many would never return home. After their service, Teamsters returned to work with their seniority intact, as employers were required to abide by their contracts and honor the service of Teamster veterans. With decades of depression and war behind her, America was ripe for expansion. As the economy shifted from wartime production to the manufacture of durable goods and consumables, the union waged an aggressive campaign to have it delivered, helping to create Teamster jobs throughout the next decade. The union's tradition of inclusion would offer membership to workers in booming post-war industries, such as automotive trades, dairy, food processing, and vending machine industries.
The Teamsters represent people in all walks of life. We were very big in the bakery industry, in the dairy industry, in the construction industry.
By the end of the decade, Teamster membership would top 1 million. The union was growing quickly and would develop new strategies to further increase its strength. Teamsters established multi-state bargaining units, and area-wide contracts were being negotiated for the first time. The Teamsters saw that they could put pressure on companies as they organized and fought for contracts by coordinating across state lines.
Farrell Dobbs, he created the concept of the secondary boycott, where he went out and organized in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Illinois, by effectively using the secondary boycott. Of course, they changed that method on us that would not allow us to do that.
For example, terminal workers in one city could refuse to load or carry merchandise handled by non-union workers in other cities, thereby forcing the non-union companies to deal with the union. These new strategies helped the union grow throughout the 1940s and 50s, while employers looked on in frustration. When Congress created the interstate highway system with its approval of the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, the face of America was changed forever. The impact on the American economy, the new jobs it would produce in manufacturing, construction, and transportation was, in a word, phenomenal, providing additional fuel to unions as they organized these new workers all over the country.
Organizing never stops. Organizing is your bloodline in a union. And the more you organize, the bigger you get, the more powerful you get.
Truckers were a visible presence on every road, and Americans knew to stop a Teamster when they needed help.
There was no question. If you were a Teamster and you walked into a diner, everybody knew everybody. You did for everybody. We were truly, in those days, knights of the highway. People would stop and help people out. We didn't care black, white, Chinese. We didn't care what their nationality was. We don't care if they were union or non-union. If a person was in trouble, historically, Teamsters stopped and helped people. And to this day, they still do, thank God.
The Teamsters had become an important player in the nation's political landscape, and their headquarters moved from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C. The union had arrived, just as employers plotted their counterattack. The pro-worker legislation of the Roosevelt era had given workers important rights. But employers armed with a new Congress and a different president were anxious to roll back worker gains in an effort to reduce labor's growing influence and maximize profits.
Certain companies don't want you to have anything. They just want you to work you to death and give you nothing for it.
While Teamsters would lobby and campaign vigorously to protect the rights of working people, Congress and the courts would turn a deaf ear and side with business interests. The Teamsters paid a high price, as many of its successful organizing and leverage tactics were outlawed by the Taft-Hartley Act.
I vetoed the Taft-Hartley bill because I'm convinced it is a bad bill. It is bad for labor, bad for management, bad for the country.
With the Taft-Hartley coming into effect, and it was an inducement for the locals to go out and organize, and they did. In 1947, the Teamsters was the largest, greatest year in increase of membership of any year in the Teamsters Union.
In 1952, after 45 years as president, Dan Tobin retired and turned the reins over to a new generation. At the 1957 convention held in Miami Beach, Florida, James Riddle Hoffa was elected general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
Life changed dramatically for the Teamsters when he came in. For instance, we had no dignity. We had no pensions. We had no health and welfare fund. And most of all, we were split in all different veins because we didn't have a master freight agreement.
He was a force to reckon with. The man had a way of dealing with corporations that was very successful.
Membership stood at 1.5 million and would grow to nearly 2 million during his administration. But organizing could not be the sole focus of this new president, as the powers that be were preparing to attack America's labor movement like never before.
As president of the Teamsters Union, Jimmy Hoffa commanded a workforce larger than the United States Army. He was a powerful man, president of the world's largest labor union.
Jimmy Hoffa had more uncontrolled power than any other person in the United States, including the president.
I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
He controlled everything that moved on a truck.
He was accused of being able to shut down this country. Quite frankly, that could have happened at one point during our history when we controlled the vast majority of the LTL freight that moved into this country. He never abused that.
When you shook hands with Jimmy Hoffa, even though Hoffa was a little fella, 5'5" or something like that, you thought you were shaking hands with somebody much bigger. Hoffa was willing to get right down in the street with the brothers and win what they had to win. And that's what people loved him for.
We thought the least we could do was give a contribution to your cause of $25,000. And whatever other help we can give you. It's my pleasure to give you this check on behalf of the International Teamsters.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Hoffa. Words are certainly inadequate for me to express my appreciation to you and the members of the Teamsters Union for this great contribution. I can assure you that it will go a long, long way in our struggle, and it will give us renewed courage and vigor to carry on. Thank you very much.
My pleasure indeed.
The mob controlled union locals around the country and used that power to push their man Hoffa to the top. Jimmy was elected union vice president in 1952. As part of his new responsibilities, he controlled the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund based in Chicago. With millions of dollars at his fingertips, Hoffa found a way to pay back his friends in the mob.
His deal with the mob was that they would help him stay in power if he would let them use the pension funds as a bank and make investments as they wanted to. Hoffa was a smart guy. He knew what he was doing, and they knew what they were doing.
Many of the pension fund loans went to mob frontmen for the construction of hotels and casinos in Las Vegas.
An estimated $170 million of Teamster pension funds went into Las Vegas.
Jimmy had the foresight to see that those were good loans and how Vegas was going to grow. And he was, in my judgment, largely responsible for Vegas being what it is today. But let's not lose sight of the fact that those loans were made to mobsters, and that was muscle that he could use.
The Kennedys were publicly attacking him every chance they had. In 1960, his name even came up during the presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy.
I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
Hoffa wasn't about to let Senator Kennedy have the last word.
Certainly it is a disgrace to the millions of Americans who heard that program to have a senator of the United States that an American citizen should not be allowed to be free when there is no pending indictments, no trials, and no charges against that individual.
Bobby Kennedy and his brother Senator John Kennedy, who served on the committee, charged that the Teamsters were controlled by the mob.
For this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that numerous people who hold responsible positions in your union come before this committee and take the Fifth Amendment because an honest answer might tend to incriminate them. Your complete indifference to it, I think, makes this bill essential.
I don't think the man did anything wrong because he never took away from us. And we're the people that he worked for, whether the government thinks he did something wrong or not.
Despite the allegations of corruption, the union's rank and file stood by Hoffa. In October 1957, he was elected General President of the Teamsters by an overwhelming 72% of the vote.
They chant Jimmy, 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 and jubilant Jimmy Hoffa sweeps in as new president of the Teamsters.
After the election, Hoffa moved to Washington, D.C. and away from his family. Being away from his family gave Jimmy even more time to focus on the Teamsters. He was determined to make the union the most powerful in America, and he did it by making himself accessible to his membership.
Hoffa understood the climate of the day and recognized that now more than ever, working men and women needed political allies.
He knew that we had to get the support of elected politicians down in Washington. And the only way we're going to get to these politicians is to make donations to people that, let's put it this way, you elect your friends and you defeat your enemy. That's the main thing. He was to raise money, make our presence known out there in the political world that we're around, we're here to stay, and we're going to support those that support the working person in this country.
In 1959, the Teamsters established DRIVE, which soon became the largest political action committee in the country.
You know what DRIVE stands for, don't you? Democratic, Republican, Independent Voters Education. DRIVE. And that's what the money was for. We used to donate, I think it was just $5 a year from all over the country for these people, these lobbyists and stuff like that, to fight for our rights.
You and your families can beat these headline artists. You can do it becoming an active member of DRIVE. You can do it where all elections are won or lost at the precinct, on the block where you live, by electing your friends and defeating your enemies. Thank you and good night. This is Jimmy Hoffa.
Despite the continued attacks on his character and the Union, President Hoffa still spent much of his time in the field, attending demonstrations, showing up on picket lines, and meeting with members. The Teamsters began organizing the airline industry and saw large growth in the bakery and dairy divisions. In 1964, Hoffa negotiated the first national master freight agreement, and overnight, 400,000 members, employed by 16,000 trucking companies, joined the middle class.
And when that went into effect, we started getting substantial raises of 25 cents, 40 cents, 50 cents. These were unheard of in the past.
His words were, when I get done and we will have a national master freight contract, everybody will be driving a Cadillac.
These were the glory years for the Teamsters. We really came up, and I believe at that time our membership expanded to over 2 million people under Jimmy.
I also bought a home, besides a brand new car.
He put 2 steaks on my table where we only used to have 1. He was great. He did the right thing.
Jimmy Hoffa Sr. brought that to us and changed our life tremendously.
It was always my father's dream to have one contract covering the entire country with the same wages, hours, and working conditions. That was his dream. And everybody said it couldn't be done because no one wanted to give up. The local leaders wouldn't want to give up their power in Chicago or New York or on the West Coast. And he was able to persuade them because of the strength of his personality to say, this is the right thing to do, join me.
This agreement was Hoffa's crowning achievement and would set the standard for collective bargaining all over the country.
And actually it was Jim that brought Teamsters up to probably the best damn union in the world. I mean, he just really brought us up to prominence.
The National Master Freight used to be the contract, I think, that most of the locals looked at and then took it from there as far as the wages, health and welfare, and pension went.
The Teamsters Union, under the leadership of Jim Hoffa and other great leaders, brought a whole group of people into the middle class. And it set a model in terms of what we did for other industries.
As the Teamsters won their groundbreaking master freight agreement, working people across the nation were embroiled in the fight for civil rights. Wherever working men and women marched for jobs, justice, and equality, Teamsters were on the front lines.
What I like to say is, as a person of color, I am so glad that I had an opportunity to walk through this type of history and see the best come out in human beings.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free.
Teamster locals collected food and clothing for African American families in Freedom Village. And the International Union adopted a formal progressive civil rights resolution, contributing members and money to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s efforts all over the South.
We thought the least we could do was give a contribution to your cause of $25,000 and whatever other help we can give you. It's my pleasure to give you this check on behalf of the International Teamsters.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Hoffa. Words are certainly inadequate for me to express my appreciation to you and the members of the Teamsters Union for this great contribution. I can assure you that it will go a long, long way in our struggle, and it will give us renewed courage and vigor to carry on. Thank you very much.
My pleasure indeed.
As Dr. King marched on Washington in 1963, thousands of Teamsters stood beside him.
We will help anybody and everybody, no matter how small the group is or how large the group is. The Teamsters are there for a family. One person's being deprived, we're going to be there for that individual.
Say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole round world.
Hoffa tried not to let his battles with the Kennedys affect his personal life. But Hoffa's troubles were far from over. The Kennedys would soon control the White House, and putting the Union boss behind bars would be high on their agenda. By now, JFK was president and had appointed his brother Bobby as Attorney General. It was Hoffa's worst nightmare.
Jimmy would say to anybody who would listen, to the reporters or anybody else, look what money can buy. Look what power can buy. Bobby Kennedy is now the Attorney General. He's never tried a case in his life. How could that be?
Jimmy's hatred for Bobby Kennedy intensified when he learned that the Attorney General's first order of business was to form a new unit in the Justice Department known as the Get Hoffa Squad. Hoffa was convinced that Bobby Kennedy wanted to destroy him because he couldn't control him.
In my opinion, he is never in his life ran up against a situation he couldn't dominate, that he couldn't control, and have his way. He's just a spoiled young millionaire that never had to go out and find a way to live by his own efforts.
One day, Hoffa and his attorney, Frank Regano, went to Kennedy's office to review court documents. Kennedy kept Hoffa waiting for 45 minutes. Jimmy was furious.
Jimmy didn't call Bobby Kennedy Bobby. He called him Booby. And so finally Booby shows up, and he's got a dog on a leash. And Jimmy just absolutely attacks him, grabs him by his throat and slams him against the wall. Says, "You son of a, you keep me waiting over here while you're walking your dog." And he had his hands firmly around Booby's throat.
Kennedy left the room without a word and never pressed charges.
You say anything to the effect that the jury treated you very well, and that you thought that you could do very well before a jury.
Now, you know, that's pretty ridiculous.
Did you say anything like that?
I did not. And I appeal to the chair that that be taken out of the record.
If you go back in history, I mean, there were other unions were under investigation, but nothing compared to the highly publicized, on TV, in-your-face campaign against Jim Hoffa and the Teamsters Union.
Bobby turned his investigation of Hoffa into a holy cause, holding hearings month after month and calling more than 1,500 witnesses.
I decline to answer this question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate.
I decline the answer on the ground. The answer I'll be incriminating myself.
Somebody that's been as successful as you can remember how to say, "I decline to answer a question," so don't put that act on.
Punishing Hoffa became a crusade.
You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
But Hoffa was contemptuous. He denied any wrongdoing, taunting the crusading young investigator.
Did you say, "That SOB, I'll break his back"?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone.
Figure of speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Mr. Hoffa, all I'm trying to find out, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm trying to find out whose back you were going to break.
Figure of speech. Figure of speech. I don't intend to have the impression left, as been stated publicly, that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
Well, I don't propose to
You haven't
be
moved
tough.
against any of them.
I don't propose to act tough, and I will follow the Constitution of the International Union.
Hoffa's temper flared when Bobby Kennedy questioned him about the rumored communist ties of other prominent union leaders.
Would you allow, as a Teamster official, a man who was a communist, who was elected by the membership?
We don't have any communists in
Just
our
answer the
Teamsters.
question.
Just a moment, please, that I know of.
What do you mean? There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt, although there can be a question about Mr. Hoffa. There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt.
Oh, wait a minute, just
He
a moment.
wasn't
Don't say
allowed
anything
into
about a
England in
question about Hoffa. There is no question about Hoffa, and don't you say that either. Don't you say that I'm a communist, or even affiliated with one. You said that enough around this country, and I want the American press to know that I resent the fact that there is any inference that I'm a communist.
Hoffa was on the road that November 22nd when he learned the news that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Days later at Teamsters headquarters, one of Hoffa's aides had lowered the flag to half-staff. When Jimmy saw the show of respect for Kennedy, he threw one of his trademark temper tantrums, fired his assistant, and raised the flag himself.
When John Kennedy was assassinated, Hoffa was happy about it. He had gotten rid of one of his biggest enemies.
Please stay back.
Hoffa received word in June 1968 that his old nemesis, Robert Kennedy, had been assassinated in Los Angeles. He was relieved when he heard the news. After all, Hoffa blamed the Kennedys for putting him behind bars. Being separated from his family was unbearable for Jimmy, but being away from the Teamsters was even more difficult. For 4 years he ran the union from prison. Then in 1971, his lawyers told him that he would not be released as long as he was still affiliated with the Teamsters. As a result, 2 days before Christmas, President Nixon commuted his sentence and allowed a much grayer and more subdued Hoffa to leave Lewisburg. But unbeknownst to Hoffa, President Nixon had added a clause to the commutation that would bar Jimmy from running for Teamster president until 1980, 9 years away.
While the 1960s and early 70s saw the Teamsters grow and prosper, the next decade would be far more tumultuous. Even the mighty Teamsters were not prepared for what would come next. Leaders of working men and women like Dr. King would be struck down by assassins' bullets. And even James R. Hoffa couldn't protect himself from those determined to end his leadership through violence. Back-to-back recessions in 1973 and 1979 rocked the nation's economy, and the repeated oil crises of the 1970s left Teamsters reeling.
I can recall there were two things that happened. The economy went down, and deregulation at the exact time. Those two events, I really believe, was the start of union membership declining, non-union companies proliferating dramatically.
When they passed deregulation in 1978 under Jimmy Carter and Teddy Kennedy, it was directed specifically at the Teamsters Union. So it was directed at them to break their back, and almost did that.
Deregulation was the biggest anti-labor legislation ever enacted in this country.
In 1980, the Motor Carrier Act passed. The result was motor carrier rates declined by as much as 25%, and more new non-union companies entered the market. Many established carriers with skilled Teamster drivers were unable to survive.
Go in a truck stop, you see it, and the guys are, say, oh, that load pays $2,000 or $3,000, whatever. Some guy will call them up and says, I'll haul that for $2,000.
Teamsters tried to fight deregulation, but without a coherent strategy and stalled organizing efforts, corporate interests and government opposition were too formidable.
I could see the start of non-union trucking companies.
A lot of people get the impression they want to become a big businessman. That's a big thing in their life. Like they buffalo these characters saying, well, you own your own equipment. You're a boss now. The bank owns you, okay? And you got to be on the road with that truck. You have to be underneath the truck.
24 hours a day. What kind of business is that? There's no business. You're nothing but a dummy to the finance institutions. That's all you are.
Adding insult to injury, newly elected President Ronald Reagan gave the green light to a new deluge of union busting.
The government basically does not like unions. Ever since the controller strike, when Reagan brought in the outside work and brought the government involved into it, everything seemed to go downhill from then.
Each year, big business lobbyists further eroded labor law, taking the teeth out of its enforcement, and companies openly flouted the law during organizing campaigns. The next 10 years were grim for all of organized labor. The Teamsters would see its size and influence sharply erode and its treasury plummet to near bankruptcy. It was the first decline in Teamster membership since the Depression, and within the union, morale was at an all-time low. In 1997, it was time to renegotiate the 200,000-member UPS contract. As UPS was the single largest employer of Teamster members, the Teamsters desperately needed this win.
You know, UPS is a very difficult company. You know, they can put a lot of pressure on you. They can do a lot of things if they want.
But UPS could see the obvious. The union was weak, membership was divided, and the strike fund nearly depleted.
I believe economics played a big part in that 97 strike, because the company felt that the union could not survive or sustain it because of the lack of funds.
What we heard is that this is a very difficult contract to resolve, and we are not making the headway that we would like to in the time frame that was designated, and that there is a good possibility that we would have to go out.
I think back in 97, they thought the time was right to bust us.
Despite long negotiations, it became clear that workers would have to strike.
They told them, they don't have any strike money. You'll be out on the street without any money. They're not that strong anymore. You're all divided. And we worked really hard as shop stewards with our business agents to get everybody back in the boat, to tell them, you know what, if we stick together, we can do anything. We outnumber them. What are they going to do if we're not there? They can't hire enough people to do our specialized jobs. So if collectively we make a statement, they've got to listen.
With the support of the entire labor movement and a huge public outcry, UPS workers won their contract after 15 days on the picket lines. The strike was a huge victory that electrified the entire nation.
The public and the customers rallied around our members in such a way that the media carried such a huge amount of press pro-union that the United Parcel Service ended up with some egg on their face.
In 1998, all eyes would once again turn to the Teamsters as James P. Hoffa was elected general president under a banner of restoring the unity and strength that the union once enjoyed.
We had been so disarrayed for such a long time. We had to bring back unity, to bring back the power.
When people are united, that's the strength. That's the strength in a union. That's the strength in anything that you talk about. I mean, when people are together with the same ideas, the same principles, and moving in the same direction, that's what you need.
Hoffa won in a one-member, one-vote direct election, a process he later codified in the Teamster Constitution and is unique within the labor movement.
Well, we've always shared the vision and belief of union democracy. We want the input of the members because the strength is in the members.
But James P. Hoffa took the reins of a very different union than the one his father once led.
Jim and I both came in 2 weeks before Christmas of '98. The building was falling down around us. I mean, there was literally garbage in the hallways, stacks of books and papers, and it was a dirty, filthy, rotten place from what I remember. This was my palace. When I was a young man and came here and saw this great building, it was an inspiration to me about this is a monument to the members that overlooks Capitol Hill.
Here's a union that at one time had over $300 million in the bank. That money had been frittered away. The membership was down. The union was divided. The money was gone. And we had to come in here and basically start cleaning up the physical structure and cleaning up the union itself.
While past administrations often focused on destroying political opponents, Jim Hoffa sought their support.
If we're not united, we could never do anything, and we cannot move into the next century or the future of the Teamsters Union. And the one thing that we've been able to do since 1999 and 2001 is to pull this union together as never before. Prior to that time, this union was in a civil war. Brother against brother, sister against sister, local against local, joint council against joint council. A tremendous fight going on in the union, a civil war like the North versus the South. And you could not do anything. You couldn't move forward because there was so much infighting.
Hoffa overhauled the union's finances and negotiated contracts with member-driven priorities.
But I think for me, coming through the door was the realization that it's just starting. Everything's just starting. You know, there's a car haul agreement waiting to be negotiated. You know, in the future, there's going to be a UPS agreement. There's going to be a freight agreement. And I've just always been one who felt that the contracts are the meat and potatoes of the union, and everything else is the gravy. And so there was just a huge challenge that could the Hoffa administration produce the contracts.
One of the first things I did within a month of being certified was to negotiate the first car haul contract. And that was a big test. Everybody said, well, what's going to happen? Is he going to be up to it? And we were able to negotiate the best car haul contract ever with overwhelming ratification. And people said, I guess we're on the right track.
Hoffa's efforts did not go unnoticed by the membership, and in 2001 he was re-elected to a second term. Hoffa's second term has been marked by major efforts to restore the union's finances and rebuild Teamster power. The administration supported a landmark dues increase, approved by the members at a special convention in 2002.
The dues increase was a good thing for everybody because now we are more powerful and we're a union that they cannot mess with.
That's just the facts. I mean, the money needs to be put there, and it has to be put there by the members.
The dues increase, it had to be done. And they were brave enough to do it because people don't like to hear dues increase.
These moves came just in time, as the 2002 UPS negotiations were already underway. This time the company got the message: settle quickly and fairly, or face a Teamsters union revitalized and determined.
There was a lot of unity. So when you got a lot of unity in the company, see there's unity, you know, you get your hands is tied. So, you know, in the process, we came together as a whole and we helped the company to grow, and we grew.
Hoffa and the negotiating committee secured a $10 billion contract from UPS, the best wage and benefit package in company history, without a strike. Hoffa went on to renegotiate the landmark National Master Freight Agreement in 2003, winning the best monetary package ever for today's 65,000 workers.
Normally you have a no-strike clause in a contract. The unique thing about the National Master Freight Agreement was that it had this ability over deadlock grievances. In midterm we could strike the employer, which gave us what we call the hammer. And we had that in that contract up until 1994. When my predecessor in office gave away the hammer. And when that happened, we lost our power in freight after 1994.
Negotiations were tough, but the Teamsters won more than anyone expected.
We got to make sure we get the right to strike. Everybody said, never be done. Can't be done. Why would the employers ever give that back to you? And I said, that's going to be our goal. And Phil said, I know how to do it. And we took a strike vote. And it came a time we even walked away from the table. And the employers started to sweat. They said, what's going on? We're down to the deadline. Where are we going with this thing? And pretty soon they came back, because Phil Young, Tyson Johnson, and myself sat down with the employers and said, there's a way to get back to the table. Bring that power back to the Teamsters Union, get the right to strike back. And sure enough, not only did we get the good wages, not only did we get everything else, but we got the hammer back. We got the hammer back. We got the power. And you know what? They ain't laughing anymore. They ain't laughing anymore.
The union's focus has returned to organizing, negotiating strong contracts, and maintaining member unity. The fundamentals that have always been the cornerstone of a successful Teamsters union. The union has also regained its reputation as the most influential and politically powerful labor organization in the country. The Teamsters are forming historic new partnerships with other unions to organize new members. The DRIVE program has been reinvigorated and is closely following issues that impact Teamster members. These new initiatives have brought the members together. Once again, the union means hope for working people. The Teamsters are well positioned and ready for whatever the next 100 years will bring.
This is a huge, big, powerful union. We can make a difference in the world.
If it wasn't for the union, there would be no middle class. We would have a total proletariat system. You either be damn rich or damn poor. There's no in between.
And I'm damn proud to be a Teamster. And I tell you, it's given me a great life. Still is. I wouldn't have it any other way.
There's 3 generations of Teamsters in my family. My father, me, and my son. So it's a Teamster thing.
I think we have to understand our history and be proud of it. Be proud of all the things that we went through, because we had to go through every single thing to be what we are today. We had to do that.
I don't want a union that's dysfunctional. I want one that shares a vision, a common goal, and wants to get the job done so that I can benefit and I can live in America and I can raise my family and I can be proud to be a Teamster. That's what I want. That's the union I want to belong to. That's the union my father belonged to. And that's the vision we have to have for the next 100 years.